In this video, I'll be going over the Denver Broncos' history in the NFL playoffs. In 1998, they played the Atlanta Falcons in the Super Bowl. That was the Dirty Bird year when Jamal Anderson had everybody doing the Dirty Bird. That was when Atlanta somehow beat both San Francisco and Minnesota on the way to the Super Bowl. And the Broncos ended up winning. John Elway was the MVP, and then he ended up retiring. And that was his second Super Bowl. Unfortunately, the Broncos have never beat the Baltimore Ravens in the playoffs. They played them in 2000 when the Ravens ended up winning the Super Bowl that year. I think that was Terrell Davis last year. He got injured. And then I'll never forget the miracle when Raheem Moore and the Broncos, Raheem Moore didn't get back deep enough, and Jacoby Jones caught that touchdown pass that Joe Flacco threw with like 30-some seconds, and Jacoby Jones walked into the end zone on the Broncos. And then that's really like the only game to go into double overtime in the NFL playoffs. And unfortunately, the Broncos couldn't come out on top in that one. The Broncos, unfortunately, haven't beaten the Buffalo Bills in the playoffs either. They played them in 1992 and ended up losing 10-7. Then more recently, the Broncos finally made it back to the playoffs. They played them again this year and got blew out, mainly because the Broncos couldn't stop the run. And Bo Nix really didn't have anybody to throw it to. When he did throw it to the receiver, they kept dropping the passes. So the Broncos ended up losing that game 31-7. Then the Broncos beat Cam Newton and the 15-1 Panthers in the Super Bowl 50. That ended up being Peyton Manning's last year. The Broncos won 24-10. And that is the only time they played the Carolina Panthers in the playoffs. Next, the Broncos against the Cleveland Browns. The Broncos are 3-0 against the Cleveland Browns in the playoffs. Most people remember the fumble. Most people remember the drive when John Elway went 98 yards to tie the game to send it into overtime. And then they played in 1990. And the Broncos won all three matchups versus the Cleveland Browns in 87, 88, and 90. A lot of those were AFC Championship games. The Broncos and the Orange Crush defense played the Cowboys in the Doomsday offense. This is back in 1977. In the Super Bowl, the Cowboys blew the Broncos out 27-10. So unfortunately, the Cowboys haven't beat the Broncos since 1995 currently. So it's about 30 years since the last time the Broncos beat the Cowboys, but they are 1-0 versus the Broncos in the Super Bowl. I meant to say it's been 30 years since the Cowboys beat the Broncos in 1995. That was the last time the Cowboys beat the Broncos. The Broncos haven't lost to the Cowboys since. Next on the list, we have the Green Bay Packers. The Broncos were underdogs in this Super Bowl versus the Packers. MVP Brett Favre going up against the aging veteran and John Elway. But this time, John Elway had some reinforcements with him. Unlike the previous other three Super Bowls he was in, this time he had a Shannon Sharpe, he had a Terrell Davis, Rod Smith. So the Broncos were able to beat the Packers 31-24. For me, the most memorable thing from this Super Bowl, this is the migraine Super Bowl when Terrell Davis had migraines and he really couldn't see. Terrell Davis ended up being the MVP. He ran all over the Packers. But the most memorable thing for me in this Super Bowl is when Steve Atwater knocked himself out and his own teammate and the Packers receiver out on the second to last play of the game. That's how hard of a hit Steve Atwater threw. Next, we have the Houston Oilers, who went on to become the Tennessee Oilers, then the Tennessee Titans. But back then, when they were the Houston Oilers, the Broncos were 2-1 versus the Oilers. They played each other in 1979. The Broncos lost 13-7. They played in 88 and 92, and the Broncos won both of those matchups against the Houston Oilers. So now you have the Tennessee Titans and the Houston Texans. I wish they still had the Oilers, but hey, what you gonna do? Now, this is one that really makes me mad the most. The Broncos could never beat the Colts. I will never forget those two games in the early 2000s when the Broncos had to play against Peyton Manning. In those two games combined, Peyton Manning had 9 touchdowns and 900 and something passing yards versus 1 interception. Peyton Manning killed the Broncos in those 2 playoff games. And then, ironically, he became the Broncos quarterback and ended up having to play the Colts. And that one was the year after the Broncos had lost the Super Bowl to Seattle. And if you remember, Richard Sherman was saying Peyton Manning, when he throws the ball wobbles and stuff. He can't hit, his arm strength is not the same. So I just remember that game, the Colts tried to test Peyton Manning's arm strength. So what they did was they played press man coverage against Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders, jamming them at the line and forcing Peyton to have to try to throw pinpoint accurate passes if he was going to beat them, and Peyton couldn't do it. Like, he would either overthrow the receivers or underthrow them. A lot of the passes weren't, he didn't have the arm strength to consistently throw those passes, and it showed, and the Broncos ended up losing that game 24-13. The next team, you had the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the Jaguars, in their second season ever, the Jaguars became a team in 1995. In their second season, they ended up making it to the AFC Championship game, and they ended up losing to New England. Because New England, that year in 96, New England played Green Bay in the Super Bowl. But ironically, so they were underdogs against the Broncos, and they beat the Broncos, who went up like 14-0 or something like that in that game. But ironically, Mark Brunell, the quarterback for the Jaguars, led the league in passing yards that year. But the rest, he had 19 touchdowns and 20 interceptions. But anyway, that was Jacksonville's second season in the NFL, and they made it to the AFC Championship game. First by beating Buffalo in the wild card, then beating the Broncos in the divisional, and ended up losing to New England in the AFC Championship game. And then the very next year, the Broncos blew them out in the playoffs and went on to end up winning the Super Bowl against the Packers. The Broncos and the Chiefs, AFC West rivals, have only played each other once in the playoffs from the 1997 season. The Broncos ended up beating the Chiefs 14-10. I think this is in a wild card round. And then the Broncos, again, they went on to win the Super Bowl against the Green Bay Packers. So this is the same year. This may have been the divisional. Because if they had just beat the Jaguars the week before, then they beat Kansas City. Then they played in the AFC Championship game. Then they go on to beat the Packers in the Super Bowl. The next year, in the 1998 season, they played the Miami Dolphins. Beat them 38-3. This is the year the Broncos finished, 14-2 on their way. Ended up winning the Super Bowl against Atlanta. But they blew the Miami Dolphins out 38-3. This must have been the divisional round, because the Broncos would have had to bye that year at 14-2. Next, this is the big one. The Broncos are 4-1 versus all-time versus the New England Patriots, with 3 of those wins coming against Tom Brady. So you can call Tom Brady is not my GOAT. I feel like Tom Brady is one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, but he is not my GOAT. I got him top 5. I feel like Peyton Manning is the greatest quarterback of all time. But anyway, the Broncos beat Tom Brady 3 times in the playoffs. The only time Tom Brady beat the Broncos is when Tim Tebow was the quarterback. And in that game, Tim Tebow only completed 9 passes for like 120 some yards. Tom Brady, give him credit, he had 6 touchdown passes that game. The Patriots were clowning the Broncos so bad. That's the year the Broncos ended up beating the Steelers, and then the next round they had to go to Foxborough and play the Patriots. But the Broncos were getting clowned so bad by the Patriots in that game that the Patriots put Aaron Hernandez in the backfield and let him run the ball. He had 55 rushing yards. Rob Gronkowski had 145 receiving yards that game. Tom Brady threw for like 343 yards and 6 touchdowns. And the Broncos got massacred 45-10. But all the rest of those games that the Broncos had played against the Patriots, the 26-16 and 13 when the Broncos beat them in the AFC Championship game to make it to the Super Bowl where they got murdered by Seattle. But I'm going to say this. The 2015 AFC Championship game against the Patriots was the greatest game for me as a Bronco fan that I've ever seen. I have never seen a team hit Tom Brady that many times as many times the Broncos hit him in that game. I think they sacked him like 6 or 7 times, and he threw 3 interceptions in that game, including the game-losing interception on the 2-point conversion try when Bradley Roby intercepted it. But again, Broncos are 4-1 versus the Patriots all time. The first one came in like 1990, in the 80s. But those other 3 came in the 2000s. Next, we have the New York Giants. They played the Broncos in the 86 season. They played them in the Super Bowl. And of course, this is one of those where the Broncos have so many like Super Bowls where they got blew out. And this was one of them against the Giants in 1986. This is one of those first 3 Super Bowls that Elway was in versus the 49ers, Giants, and Redskins where he just got massacred. So the Broncos are 0-1 versus the Giants in the playoffs, unfortunately. Next, you got the Oakland Raiders, now the Las Vegas Raiders, and at one time the Los Angeles Raiders. The Broncos are 1-1 versus the Raiders in the playoffs. They beat them in 1978, well, the 77 season, and they beat them. The Raiders beat the Broncos in the 1993 season. But the Broncos have a 1-1 record versus the Raiders, which I'm surprised those two haven't seen each other more often in the playoffs. The Jets, the Broncos, on the year they won the Super Bowl, the Broncos beat the Jets 23-10 in the divisional round. That's the only time. I'm surprised that's the only time that the Broncos and the Jets have played each other in the playoffs. Some of these seem like the Broncos never played the Titans. Well, of course, they played the Oilers, but they never played the Titans. They only played the Jets once. They only played the Chargers once. I'm surprised they only played the Chiefs once. But, so again, yeah, the Chargers. They played the Chargers in 2014. Well, 2013, and the year they went to the Super Bowl, ended up losing Seattle, and they won that game. So the Broncos are only 1-0 versus the Chargers in the playoffs. So again, a lot of these, like AFC, the Broncos have played 46 playoff games, I want to say. The Broncos, however, are 5-3 versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. They beat them in 1976, lost to them in 77, lost to them in 83, but they haven't lost it. Oh, well, they did lose to the Steelers in 2005. And if the Broncos would have beat the Steelers that year, then they would have played Seattle in the Super Bowl. 2012, that's the Tim Tebow, Demaryius Thomas game where Tim Tebow hit Demaryius Thomas on that slant in overtime, sending them to New England to get massacred 45-10. And then the Broncos ended up beating the Steelers in 2015. And that's the game Antonio Brown did not play. Antonio Brown had 200 and some receiving yards earlier in the season versus the Broncos. And they were very fortunate that he didn't play in the playoffs versus them. So this is the most lopsided Super Bowl ever when John Elway and the Broncos got murdered 55-10 versus San Francisco. I think Joe Montana had like 5 or 6 touchdowns that game. But yeah, in the 1989 season, the 49ers just murdered the Broncos. So the Broncos, unfortunately, are 0-1 versus the 49ers in the playoffs. But yeah, so I don't even know what to say about that. And then you got Seattle. So for those who are old enough to remember, Seattle used to be in the AFC West with the Chargers, the Raiders, the Broncos, and the Chiefs. But once the Texans became a team, they had to realign the divisions and stuff. So they moved the Seahawks to the NFC. But the Broncos and the Seahawks did play in the playoffs in 1982 season. The Seattle Seahawks beat them 31-7. Then, of course, everybody knows the Broncos got massacred by the Seahawks in the Super Bowl, 43-8. When the Broncos statistically still have the greatest season ever from 2013, and they were dismantled and only held to 8 points in the Super Bowl by the Legion of Boom in Seattle. And then last, again, you have one of those blowouts that John Elway suffered. This is the Doug Williams Super Bowl, when Doug Williams was the MVP and became the first black quarterback to win the Super Bowl. And this is, I think, this is the second one, because the Giants beat them in 86, Redskins beat them in 87, and then the 49ers beat them in 89. So this is one of the 3 Super Bowls that John Elway lost. So in summary, the Broncos have played 43 playoff games and have won 23 out of 43. They have a winning record versus New England, Pittsburgh, the Oilers, the Browns, the Chiefs, the Jets, the Dolphins, the Chargers, the Panthers, the Packers, and the Falcons. And they have a losing record versus Baltimore, Buffalo, the Giants, the Redskins, the 49ers, and have tied with like the Raiders and the Jaguars. But let me know in the comment section, how do you think the Broncos will do in the future? Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, like and comment. More videos coming soon. Trey T out. Peace.